having watermelon smiles. Pickaninnies, he described Muslim community as being women looking like bank robbers. The fact that everybody's wearing a mask today and we all look like bank robbers doesn't seem to have cast their mind. I would appreciate if Boris Johnson wore a mask. I don't want to see his face. Or if you look at the question of Dominic Raab. Dominic Raab says he doesn't understand why people take the knee and says it's got something to do with Game of Thrones. That's obvious because during the COVID crisis that disproportionately affected Black and BAME communities, he was probably watching the box set, instead of dealing with the real problems. That's why Britain, in terms of, or UK, in terms of a state, has had a disastrous COVID crisis. So The Economist says that, not our finest hour, 60,000 deaths according to the Financial Times. Why is this important for racism? It's because when it comes to the explanation, we've been told that the problems in our society are related to immigration, migration, migrants take more than they give. If you look at the media headlines, in other words, politically, it's a useful tool. If you look at what's going on in institutions, what people say is there's a few bad apples, that you can't condemn the whole system. There's a few police officers that may behave in a rogue way and murder people, but there's something that you can't say is intrinsic to the system. I was part of the Macpherson inquiry in 1998 when Macpherson, who was by no ways a radical or revolutionary, described the Metropolitan Police as being, and the police force as being institutionally racist. That was because he had to do a careful survey. And don't forget, Mr. Clooney, Baron Clooney, as he was known, was a former head of the SAS. So he was so shocked by what was exposed in the inquiry, he was forced to accept what was taking place. And really, it's to do with, it doesn't stem from a few bad apples or a relatively small number of flawed individuals who find themselves in position of power. It's something which is far more systematic. And, really what you see is racism and corruption is part of the way that our society works. And when we come on to policing at the moment, we notice that under lockdown, that you're more likely to have been stopped if you were Black and tested. Think about Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings is able to say he was testing his eyesight. That's the reason why he drove nearly 500 miles there and back in the middle of a COVID crisis, despite himself having the disease, being a super spreader. And I think really what that tells you is that the ruling class, the way our society is structured, is to justify those people at the top. Michael Gove admits taking cocaine on 20 times. He doesn't think that this is a case where he can no longer be the Prime Minister or offer himself as being the Prime Minister. He sincerely apologizes, says he won't do it again. I'd love to have that defense in court when I get up there. In other words, the law is not a reflection of that. It's a reflection of the people, how they run our society. Disproportionately, Black communities make up maybe 10% of the population of the UK, more inside the United States. But really, the role of the state, the way that it works, is to make sure that it maintains institutional control. So when you look at the police and you look at the things like stop and search, you see that people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched. In fact, Theresa May, no necessarily a radical revolutionary herself, changed stop and search because he said it was a pointless exercise. He said stopping people and searching them was not leading to any kind of change. And it's actually because when police look at people, they see IC3, which is designation for somebody Black, all kinds of attributes are added to that in terms of criminality. And all the time, people will say, oh, there's been an incident and we're looking for people like that. But that's not really applied for any other thing. They don't do that in Wall Street. They certainly don't do that in the City of London in terms of looking for criminals. Although if you look at something like in Germany, in the major companies, most crime is concentrated there, but you don't see them kicking down doors and assaulting people. That's because the institutions there, as when Peel set up the police force, he set it up in order to maintain order so that the rest of us could go to work and then those laws should be in that place. I'm not arguing that police do not direct traffic. I'm arguing something much more importantly, that there's a man called Antonio Gramsci, and he put forward the idea of hegemonic control, that if you wanted to control a society, you had to put forward big ideas, or ideas that made sense to people. He described the difference between common sense and good sense. And the common sense idea is to try and make people into different categories. We've seen this by the, if you want to understand how we got to Windrush and with the Windrush scandal, which was where people were systematically denied the rights to be British citizens. Some people, my family, were caught up in that. You know, their rights were denied, and they were simply denied because the top of the society decided that these people were expendable. They had actually ratcheted up a whole atmosphere about people taking benefits, living off things. So they wanted to use people as an example, and they thought it'd be easier to pick on black people. One of the problems they found was that when they went to pick on black people, lots of people said, I know some people are muggers, I know some people are thieves, I know some people are drug dealers, but not my next door neighbor, not my friend that I've worked with for 20 years, not the person that I married, not the person that's intermarried into my family. These aren't the problems. So when we talk about institutional racism affects people in different ways. And the people at the top of our society maintain that hold both politically, economically, and socially. And the state is an integral part of maintaining inequalities. It's an integral part of maintaining inequalities. And when it does change, it changes because of struggle. Let's be honest, the changes that are taking place now inside the United States is because of 750 demonstrations that have taken place. The changes that are taking place in this country is because 160 demonstrations have taken place and have exposed the link between COVID and also the link between disproportionate deaths in our society. So the way that racism works is that racism is a systematic form of oppression in which the oppressors identify and see that there's imputed characteristics of the people they oppress as being inferior. So it can be on an individual basis. And so for us, racism isn't something which is just in people's heads. It's materially based in the way our society works. Our society works by people competing with each other in order to get jobs, competing with each other to get life chances, to get education. Our society is based on competition. That's what Marx and Engels found out early on when they began to unearth, and what they say is inside the Communist Manifesto, they unearthed the inner workings of the way that capitalism works. Even if you look at the 1% of people that own 80% of the wealth, part of that is not everybody should automatically access to them, but actually people identify them. Think about that worker that flew a plane across saying all white lives matter in Burnley. His position in society isn't one at the top, but he identifies with the people at the top. And the state, in some ways, recruits people and operates on that basis and has a planned way of profiling people and treating them as institutionally not accepted. And the key parts of that is, there's a man called Lenin. He described the nature of the state as being prisons backed up by courts. In other words, the way the criminal justice system ends. If you're more likely to be picked up, if you're more likely to be discriminated against, you're more likely to find yourself caught up in them. 1 in 3 people that find themselves caught up in the system find themselves locked up. And really, one of the first things you have to do is that, there's a report called Out of Order, and it talks about how police view young black people, and they inherently see them as being criminal. Even the people that shoot people say, I was in fear of my life. That's the reason why I did it. The description of the policeman that shot Mark Duggan was, Mark Duggan was 5'7", was about 12 stones, but his description was beast-like, scary. In other words, he used old empire ideas of racism in order to justify the present behavior. There's something about these people that can't be controlled. And I think the state, with the actors within it, play that role. But it's not just in that. It's like in the NHS. The NHS report, England, showed that managers disproportionately put black workers on COVID wards, even though they were sent to other places. So even in institutions which we venerate and wouldn't exist, I believe, without migrant labour, you see discrimination taking place there because people that set racist ideas implement it into the schedule. And on top of that, without strong unions, without confidence of those people, then they find themselves the victims of that. And I think that when we talk about how we begin to change it, we have to understand that the way that racism works is the way Frederick Douglass says. They divide each to conquer both. They attack black communities in order to misdirect people. Think about the question of prevent. Prevent is institutional racism. It targets Muslims. If you look at the Channel program, it targets Muslims in particular and says that these people are different groups. Even the tragedy in Reading, which was a tragedy of somebody suffering from mental health, people wanted to treat it because the person was Arab and Muslim, therefore we'll treat this as a terrorist incident, when in fact it was a mental health incident. And I think that one of the things you get from that is a narrative that develops inside the state to try and explain things. £100 million is spent on spending on prevent, which is admitted a year. It's much, much higher than that. But if you compare that to the spending that was on COVID, preventing COVID, or Operation Cygnus, which was the plan to simulate if there was a pandemic inside this country, if you look at the spending on something that actually killed 60,000 people, was a real threat to people, and they knew it was a real threat, what you find is that they didn't do that because actually much of the state apparatus was about defending two political things. Firstly, reinforcing the racist ideas that were put forward. Savage Javid changed Theresa May's stop and search protocol because he said that policemen were afraid to stop people because they were being accused of being racist. They've never been afraid of being accused of being racist. So, Savage Javid, whatever he's taking, he might be, taking the same drugs that Michael Gove did. I mean, apparently the Prime Minister sneezed when he did it, but some indication there's something wrong with these people. Is there something wrong with the word Dominic? Why you have two idiots that are at the top of the society doing that and trying to divide people? But what the Islamophobia told us in the background of imperialist wars was this was implemented into the state. It became part of statute. Every teacher, every hospital, everything was a way of checking people. But this fed into something called the hostile environment. Recently, about 2 years ago, I went to hospital because I wasn't well, and somebody asked to see my passport. And I said, can I see yours first? To make sure that, otherwise I might have to have you arrested because you might be having this job in a false preneur. And I'm checking on it. Under the law, individuals are allowed to check on it if they're involved in a service. Of course, what I'm saying is they turned that service into an immigration check. Again, means that people are checking on people. What's been, I think, inspirational about what's been taking place in the background of the George Floyd murder has been the sheer number of uprisings that's taken place in the United States. I think one of the most important arguments that's come forward is the question of defund the police, to take that money away. Some places are doing this in Los Angeles, and I think some of that should be done here. The prevent budget should be scrapped and immediately put forward to the NHS to prevent a second wave, our government's hell bent on a second wave, but something that does that. But institutional racism is embedded into the way that capitalism works. There's modification for it, and don't get me wrong, a state like an apartheid state or Jim Crow state that was enforced by law, we want to get rid of that. But actually, what's embedded into the state is a suspicion of the mass populace inside this country. Karl Marx said something interesting about this state. He talked about how racism was used at that time to divide the English and the Irish workers. And he said that was the source of the weakness of the English proletariat. The English proletariat couldn't be free because 8 million labour had been brought to Britain as the foundation for building its industrial revolution. And that he said that the Irish and the English hate each other and compete against each other. In other words, competition drives racism, and that competition that needs to be managed is managed by the state, and there's an interrelationship between them. What happens when people see common interests when millions of black and white people march and say Black Lives Matter, then actually it paralyzes the state both politically and sometimes physically as people take to the streets. That's what's happened successfully in terms of challenging institutional racism in this country. Many years ago, when I was a little boy, there used to be a program called Dixon of Dock Green. And if you're very young, you will not know what it means, but they always presented the police as being the honest broker. Today, you know, if you watch cop programs, they talk about corruption, they talk about racism, because it's actually a reflection of what part of the state does. And I think that people know that. So today, when people say people accept there's institutional racism, the Macpherson accepted institutional racism. By the way, institutional racism was something which was first defined by a man called Hamilton, who was a Black Panther. He was part of the the 68 movement, which he described as a revolutionary movement to describe institutional racism. It's come so far, it's shifted so far that the state accepts, or parts of the state accept itself, that parts of its dysfunctional nature is based on racism, is based in a way of forcing people. And what we have to understand, the police are there to protect enormous wealth. When you join the police, it says, I'm here you read the book, it says, I'm here to protect Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth's peace. And the Queen has enormous peace. She has enormous pieces of land and wealth and various other things. And with the rest of the people, enormous pieces of land and wealth, that's fundamentally the role of the police, to protect the running order of our society. But if you're trying to talk for equality, if you're trying to say you don't want to discriminate against each other, then actually the resources that are put in there could be put into something which is much better, that actually reaches people's needs. And also the society that drives people to compete against each other brings forward all the filth that exists in our society. It's embedded in the way that capitalist society discriminates against each other. It's embedded in the way that it discriminates in terms against women, LGBT society, but also against the working class. That class is a class that produces all the wealth in society. Look what happened in lockdown when people were asked to stop working. Everything stopped. Richard Branson went to his island, but it didn't make any difference whether he was in his island or in his mansion or on one of the planes. What mattered was the people that produced the wealth. And the question of managing them is essential to the way our society works. The first racist laws, which were brought in by the British, by the way, after the Bacon Revolt in America, because poor white people and black people are joined together to fight the crown, they brought in the slave laws to define racial equality as something which is embedded in our society. Racism, as we understand it, is a relatively concept of modernity. It's not something that's always been there. It's a feature of modern capitalist society over the last 300 to 400 years. Just as much as a computer or the television or the motor car is a feature of modern society, so is concepts like racism and systematic discrimination based on the state. How do we challenge this? Firstly, we can challenge this as individuals. I think if you're not in the Socialist Workers' Party, I'd like you to join. The best anti-racist, anti-sexist people fighting for LGBT rights are in our organisation. Secondly, we have to reject and organise against the people that want to maintain this. And that requires two things. One, a careful assessment about where we are, and then also working with other people and trying to get them to agree with us about a strategy that can go forward. They say don't bend the knee, we organise for bending the knee at 6 p.m. We didn't do it on our own, we did it in a united front. So we have to build united fronts, work with other people in and out of the organisation. The other thing I want to say is there an alternative way of changing the racism in the state? Can we take over the police force and change it from within? Can we elect a Labour government that would make it more appealable to do that? The problem is that if you are part of a government that wants to run the British society, you have to have immigration controls. You have to have racist policing. You have to have all those things. So can you abolish institutional racism through Parliament? Actually, the experience of the last 100 years is no, you haven't been able to do that. It doesn't mean there's not good people on our side. I'm good friends with Diane Abbott. I'm good friends with Jeremy Corbyn. I respect these people. But at the end of the day, when the pressure comes down to it, as Keir Starmer's done, he passed a law to protect statues that said it should be a criminal offence. He backed the government, but didn't really push it, but said you shouldn't throw statues into the sea. These questions, why did he do it? Not because he was worried about can the statue swim, he was worried about could he appease those people at the top of society to say they're not a threat. Will I remove the weapon of racism from you? But actually, that's what that's what's taking place. That doesn't mean we don't work with people that have those views, but the most effective way of challenging, destroying racism at the end of the day is revolution. People say William Wilberforce led a mass movement against slavery, but the detonator was Toussaint Louverture in the San Domingo Revolution, the Black Jacobins, who smashed slavery through revolution, liberated themselves, and challenged the entire establishment, beat the French, beat the British, beat the American armies, and made sure, which they never forgave them for. And that is our starting point. If you want to get rid of racism, you have to get rid of the society that creates it, but we have to be sophisticated about how we do that, how we build our organization, accept that we are a small minority trying to work inside a bigger minority, but in that bigger minority, the majority of people back us up in the fight against racism. That's why we defeated the BNP. That's why we defeated the EDL. Imagine if there'd been an EDL or BNP now in full organization, what difference that makes. You can make a difference against fighting racism today. But what we do have to do, finally, is a question to make sure that we have a black and white leadership that can actually challenge that. Every time we've challenged it, they've killed our leaders. They killed Martin Luther King when he challenged the question of who should run the state. They killed Malcolm X. They killed the Black Panthers. For us, the question of power and transformation is the key question for ourselves. What makes people change? You see, when people are in struggle and they see their common enemy, they forget the things that divide them and concentrate on the things that unite them. And it's important that we understand that. There's a man called Trevor Phillips. He lives in a big house in Hampstead. He's black like me, but he identifies with the ruling class. Priti Patel is black like me, but she identifies with the ruling class. Savage Javid is black like me, but he identifies with the ruling class. The question for us is class unity, class struggle, and true liberation for all of us. And that's the reason why we say Black Lives Matter. And that's why we say institutional racism you can only get rid of institutional racism when you get rid of the institutions. In the meantime, we have to fight institutional racism and build an alternative. And that's why I'm asking you, please join the Socialist Workers' Party so that our children and our children's children can look back on this period and see that it was a disgusting period in human history, and we changed it by united action ourselves. Let's get that two-tone movement going that came out of Coventry. Let that music play all over the world. Revolution, solidarity, and unity. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Wayman. That's excellent. Folks, we have shared our Socialist Worker, a link to it in the chat, which is our weekly newspaper. We have shared a membership form, and I think there is a website, a link to a website of our theory, just so you can get a bit more of an idea of what we're about as an organisation. So we're going to go into the contributions now. For those of you who arrived during the meeting, I'll go over again quickly how you participate. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a button that says participants. If you press that, a box will open to your right, and there is a button in that box that says raise hand. So a little blue hand will come up next to your face on my screen, and I will know that you want to contribute, and I will call you in order. Most of you, I'll let you speak a bit longer, or around 3 minutes. Those of you who have been coming here for 20 years, I'm going to be a bit firmer on the timing, but you know that. But you know, everyone else, please, if you're new, we'd love to hear from you. So just raise your hand and I'll call you in some kind of order. And also you can unmute yourselves to contribute. So please dive in, folks. You sure no one wants to put their hand up? It's a very short meeting, if not.
Does everybody agree with me? This is the first time.
A few hands have finally come up. That'd be nice, wouldn't it?
You mean you don't agree with me? Fine. Sorry.
That's all right. Two of you have put your hands up, three of you. Out of Dave and Mark, I don't know which one was first, so I'm going to go with Dave first, then Mark, then Tony, if that's all right, and then Patricia. So Dave.
Yeah, I wasn't planning to contribute, but since you were begging, Tamsin, I thought I'd say a couple of words. No, just really, it's just a thought was about, I was thinking about how, particularly in some areas of the country in the north and so forth, when we used to have council housing, how it was effectively segregated by the local councils, which, you know, has had all sorts of consequences. You know, claims that people won't integrate because they are effectively put into separate boxes by the council. This happened many years ago. Of course, we don't have much council housing left nowadays, but it's just another indication of, you know, how pervasive institutional racism was and still is. That's just a thought on that. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thanks, Dave. Next will be Mark Collins, who has walked off somewhere. Oh, he's back. Brilliant. Okay, Mark, off you go.
Oh, yeah, you can hear me. So I just put the washing machine on spin. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, right. Okay. What? On the news tonight, there was a young black kid who was tasered, and he was tasered, and I think he's lost all ability from the waist, neck down, basically disabled down. He was trying to run away from the police. When they caught him, he had a small bit of cannabis on him for personal use, but he'd been arrested a couple of days earlier, and that's why he ran, basically, because he'd been arrested with cannabis. You know what I mean? He only had a small, like, personal amount on him, and they got him, arrested him. Then he panicked and he ran, and he was trying to jump over a wall, and they tasered him, and he fell off the wall, broke his back, sadly, and he's now paralysed. And the cop who's obviously did it and tasered him, he's been doing for criminal, maybe. I think he'll probably get off, probably. But all the white kids by me, up by the park, literally 30 of them, they're all smoking cannabis every night. Oh yeah. Sorry, every night they're smoking. There's never ever any police there, anything like that. And the vast majority of young kids now, white kids, probably age between 18 and 24, are smoking cannabis. I've never ever heard of them when I'm being tased. Never. And thinking about it now, you're more likely to be tased if you're black than if you're white. In fact, I don't even know anybody who's been tased. And I do know a few people, and the word gets around. So on that point, yeah, it's still relevant. What I want to ask the question is, a lot of the big arguments I've been on Facebook is this this thing about 400 years. It was 400 years ago, slavery. It's 400 years. Forget about it and stuff like that. And you know, we all lives matter. That sort of argument. And this is taking a hold. I think we're beating them. You know, I think our side is winning on that argument, but they're trying to creep in, aren't they? And what I want to ask is we need a modern perspective on it. You know what I mean? We need all the information about the arrest. You're more likely 10 times more likely to be arrested. You're more likely to die in a police cell. You're less likely to get, you know, the job promotion as things like that. And that's what really want to sort of concentrate, because people are trying to who want to sort of go against the Black Lives Matter argument. It's this slavery thing. We want to sort of move. It's what's happening today that's really important, and that's really want to sort of my contribution, my question really as well is that.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. Next is Patricia.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, Okay. Yeah, thanks, Wayman. That was great. I was just thinking about what you said about the police, and that the quote from what you were saying was that the police have never been afraid of racism. And my question is, how do we make them afraid of racism? Because I feel really strongly about the amount of black deaths in police custody that are basically no one ever seems to be held accountable for them. They are acquitted almost universally, and it just makes me feel really angry about the whole thing. And as Mark mentioned tasers, we had an incident locally where someone was tasered, actually was basically cornered in a police bail hostel and tasered, and the only place, he was surrounded by police and beaten, and the only place where there were no cameras were in this toilet where they actually cornered him. But as you said rightly, there is one incident after another and one death after another where no one is held accountable. And yeah, how do we do it? How do we actually break through this somehow to accept this is murder, basically? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks Patricia. I've got Tony and then Dave K and no other hands up, so please put your hand up, participate. You're welcome to speak. We'd like to hear what you have to say.
Hiya, it's not Tony, it's Andrea.
Andrea, sorry.
I'm masquerading, not really. Yeah, I'd just like to say thanks to Wayman for a really, really good, more than good, very inspirational talk, which hopefully the people can take some inspiration from. I think one of the main points he made, and I think clarified for me, is that people like Trevor Phillips, Priti Patel, they are black, but they don't identify with the struggle which is going on right now. And the reason for that is because they identify with the ideas of the ruling class, and their vested interest is in keeping that ruling class in place, because they want to preserve their privilege, and they don't want us to be united together to fight institutionalized racism and the brutality of the police, which has been going on for years. Change won't come from the top. It won't come from the likes of Priti Patel and Trevor Phillips. Change will come from us, from below. And as Wayman was saying, it is the work. It's the class issue. It's the working class who, black and white, Asian, working together and fighting together will make the change. What the ruling class, the Priti Patels and the Trevor Phillips, Syed Javid want to preserve what they've got. They don't want us to fight together. Their tactic is to divide and rule, and to emphasise the differences, so-called, between races. I think our argument is that racism is a justification for that, and it's a spurious cultural and a construct which they rely on to keep us down. But what is inspirational about the last few weeks here and in America is how people are working together and fighting together, black and white, old and young. And that's what we've got to keep doing. You know, we've been doing it since Rock Against Racism, since the Anti-Nazi League, the Civil Rights Movement. And it's in our vested interest to keep that going, to keep taking the knee, to keep working together. You know, I'm working with people from America at the moment, and a couple of weeks ago they said, oh, we understand that people are joining the fight over there in England. I said, yeah, of course we are. You know, it's across borders, and you know, we are fighting because of what happened to George Floyd, but we're still, you know, we were fighting before that. So, you know, it's not a matter of over there, over here. It's an international and cross-border issue as well. And, you know, it's about the international working class as well as the working class in each of those countries. So yeah, that's it.
Excellent, thank you, Andrea. I've got Dave K and no further contributors. So, oh, is it Mamuna? Hello, Mamuna. So it'll be Mamuna, and then anyone else, please put your hand up, please contribute. If it's just a question that you want to ask, that you want to direct to the speaker, that would be lovely as well. But Mamuna.
Hello, thanks, Tamsin. These are very interesting times, and I just want to talk about my experience in my very white workplace in recent times. I'm a social worker, and I work for a youth offending team in leafy Warwickshire, which, not that leafy, our clientele, albeit very white, very working class as well, as you can imagine. They're the people that are going to be coming into contact with the criminal justice system. And I've been working there since 2013, soon after I qualified, and there have been 2 occasions since 2013 when race has been an item on our business team meeting, when it's been an agenda item that has been discussed with the whole service. The first time was a couple of years ago, when the remand rate at the yacht that I work for is very low, but the remand rate at that time had hit 100%, with 2 kids that had been sent down. And lo and behold, both those kids, you can join the dots together yourself, they were both non-white in a very white local authority. So obviously this raised alarm bells in management's heads. This raised all sorts of questions, and the need to have a conversation about race was something that was raised with the whole organisation. Naturally, my initial question, I'm very suspicious by nature anyway, was why? Why, after all these years, why are you talking about race? Why are you bothered about race? What has happened? What shit has hit the fan to make you want to talk about race now? Something must have gone wrong. There must have been a serious incident, a critical incident, something. And of course, 2 black kids in prison, which makes it 100% non-white population. A very embarrassing fact for my employers, which I pointed out, but I don't think that was received very well. But anyway, digress. So that was the first time. The second time has been in recent weeks. That race has been on the agenda again, and something that has been discussed very openly in my very white workplace, with a clientele, a service user group that is also very, very white, despite what I've just said before about the prison population being 100% non-white. And what I'm feeling about these last few weeks and the discussions that it's brought about over the last few weeks is, we were talking about it, in fact, this morning in one of our meetings on Teams. And we were asked, just as a sort of an icebreaker, who would you like to play you in the story of your life as an icebreaker? And there's a sort of dreaded, oh God, I have to go along with this and participate in this when I've got sodding work to do and I don't have time for this crap. But anyway, so I said Angela Davis, because she talked about it's very important to not just be seen as not a racist, and not just to declare yourself as not a racist, but to also be an anti-racist. And that was a comment that was directed at everybody in my workplace, to understand the gulf between saying I'm not a racist and being an actual anti-racist. You know, they're a world apart. They're not two. They're not. It's not the same thing. There's a gulf between the two. And what I want to know is, Wayman may probably shake his head and think I'm asking the same thing again, because I know I've asked this before when he's done a meeting in Coventry about the Nazis. 400 years, how much fucking longer is my question. I'm getting very old and very tired, and I'm tired of compromise, and I'm tired of working with people and seeing situations where people are passed by and treated as second-class citizens. And, you know, when is it going to end? How is it going to end? And I really hope what has been happening over the last month is not a flash in the pan, and is not something that will just fizzle out like other demonstrations and other protests have been in the past. I really, hand on my heart, hope that is not going to be the case here, because I'm sick and tired of this, and we need change, is what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamuna. That was an excellent contribution and really powerful. I hope you make more contributions in future. Thank you. Our next speaker is Abby O, and then I don't have anyone who's got their hand up after that. So please put your hand up. As I say, ask us questions. You can direct questions to the speaker as well if you like. Abby O.
Hi, I'm just going to start my video. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Newbie here. I really enjoyed the discussion so far. I've noted down a few points, but I think the thing that struck me really from what everyone's saying, and I think it was Patricia and, well, I know it's not Tony, but the lady with Tony's identity. One question that really just keeps, I guess, resonating with everything that's been happening so far, really, to me is, and I'm just going to put it out there because, you know, what is it that white people are so afraid of when it comes to the whole Black Lives Matter, that whole concept? Because, you know, we've had this recent incident with the Reading stabbings and this terrorist attack, and you know, me as a Black person, as a human being, you know, your heart goes out to any victim of crime, you know, especially when they've been murdered. And when I look at that situation, I you know, one of the questions I was thinking is, imagine somebody saying, well, all stab victims matter too. You know, it doesn't make any sense at all, given the context of what you're dealing with. And that's essentially how I feel when it comes to Black Lives Matter. So my question really is, you know, when I look at it, it's like, what is it that white people are afraid of, you know, that they feel is going to happen just by acknowledging racism? What's going to happen? You know, what is going to happen if, you know, you actually see the inequalities that happen in society, the injustice that happens, and you want to correct that? How is that going to impact their lives? What is it that they're afraid of? That's the burning question for me, honestly. And I don't know if anybody on this call can answer that, but it does just perplex me, because I can't imagine that even as a white person, if I'm a white person right now and seeing the way the world is, I can't imagine being comfortable. You know, even if I'm comfortable in my privilege, I can't be comfortable in the chaos it's causing. You know, so what is it that I want to hold on to so badly that would make me think that this is okay?
That's a really good contribution and an excellent question, Abby. Thank you. I've got Andy from Leicester, and then I think your name was Kelly, Joe Loving Kind of Girl. You're next after Andy. Okay, folks, thank you.
Okay, I mean, it was just quickly. I mean, I think that last question is quite a difficult one. I mean, it's very difficult for me to answer because I don't understand where those white people are sitting. And I mean, I think really the point I wanted to say was that the white people are not all the same and do not think all the same. And, you know, the many white people are active anti-racists. And I mean, both my daughters were on the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and there was one in Edinburgh, and she was sort of feeling guilty about being white. And I was saying, well, no, you shouldn't. Look, you are at least third generation anti-racist. So my earliest political memory is my mother refusing to buy South African oranges. And my mother was in the Communist Party, well, both my parents were in the Communist Party, and you know, they were, at their core was being anti-racist and being active. So they were campaigning against apartheid, they would campaign against any sort of racism. They were, you know, totally abhorrent about the BNP and the National Front and so on. I mean, I've been active as an anti-racist all my life, and I've brought my kids up to do that. So I think, you know, for vast swathes of white people, they are active anti-racist. And I think, you know, because, you know, we have the slogan, black and white, unite and fight. I mean, you know, if all white people were racist, it wouldn't make any sense. Why would black people want to unite with racists? I mean, you know, we're not expecting them to do that. You know, we want black and white, non-racist people to fight together. And that predominantly over history is the vast majority of white people, I think, are not racist. It's the minority that get pulled along by those arguments.
That's excellent, Andy. Thank you. Next, I've got Joe Loving Kind of Girl, who I think your name was Kelly, and then Chetna, and then Dave A. Please come in.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm actually connecting from Nottingham tonight. I'm a urology cancer nurse specialist at a hospital, and I'm the youngest in my team. There is another black lady that I work with and a medical secretary of mixed heritage. And I'm really passionate about things that are occurring at the moment. And I'm really struggling within my team with some of them. So the team is there's 7 of us. And I'm struggling with some individuals who don't really have much to say about it. So I've been quite vocal on my social media, and I've tried to broach it at work to some individuals just to kind of get a conversation going. I feel quite emotional about it because I've got so much that I want to say, and so much I'm really battling with in regards to some of the things that I'm seeing on the media and some of the stories that are coming out, a kind of PTSD, a form of PTSD for me. A lot of it is bringing back old experiences that I've experienced when I was younger, as a child, and experiencing racism. So my main problem is I feel that as though I'm going to work and you know, I'm out there looking after people, and you know, my team, we're all supposed to be health advocates and standing up for the health of individuals and caring for individuals. And yet I'm feeling as though quite isolated within my team, that we can't have healthy discussions about what's occurring and something that is affecting me. And I was a bit taken back by the medical secretary, who is of mixed heritage. Her mother's white and her dad is from Trinidad, and she actually said, well, surely, well, when I did kind of broach it, she, I got the impression she was a little bit defensive and was like, well, surely all lives matters. And I agreed with her. I said to her, well, no one's saying that, you know, no other lives don't matter. When I talk about Black Lives Matter, it's not just the title, it's deeper than that. And I'm just struggling with staying true to who I am, but wanting to kind of teach and kind of educate some of those that don't really have much to say about it. And I don't know whether they don't have much to say about it because it's a so uncomfortable subject. But I want them to not feel uncomfortable, but I want them to be conscious about it, because it is something that you know, Black people have to kind of walk in that kind of uncomfortableness on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, I'm just struggling how to broach it and try and teach and educate some of my colleagues that I'm working with in a predominantly white working area, without coming across as a, you know, angry PTSD fueled individual within my work team. And then another point, so just to make, is I'm particularly upset by one of my colleagues, one of my friends who I used to work with on an old ward, who hasn't really said anything whatsoever. And I think she's aware that I'm upset with everything that's happening at the moment. I've talked about experiences, but she has nothing to say. And it's almost like she's just kind of skirting around it and not really giving me the opportunity to talk about things that, you know, basically what was just is human rights, you know, for us really. I don't want people to kind of get, I wish people didn't get so caught up on the Black Lives Matter, the actual title, and actually if they did do the research and understand the meaning behind it, which is, you know, we're asking for equal opportunities and the cut down on police brutality and things like that. I'm struggling that, to summarise, I'm just struggling with individuals who are my colleagues, who I consider as friends, and we are in the same working environment, so it's be caring and looking after each other, and yet we're struggling to do it amongst ourselves. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
That was an excellent contribution. I mean, I'm sure the speaker will come back on that, but there's a good article that I've seen going around. It's from Vox, and it goes over the All Lives Matter argument. And I mean, there's quite a few different things going around that deal with the argument. One of them is something like, you know, when Paris was attacked, we didn't say all cities matter. You know, we prioritise Paris. And similar with other such incidences, or when someone is campaigning about breast cancer, we don't say all cancers matter. We prioritise the vulnerable in each situation. But I work in the NHS, and I find as well it can be a difficult thing to broach. So you're not alone in that. Our next speaker is Chetna, and then Dave, A, Clive, and Sean. But Chetna, unmute and speak. Thank you.
Hi guys, so I just wanted to kind of share something with you and get your thoughts on something. So I know those of you who were on last week, I spoke about white fragility, and I had a conversation with a white man who didn't really have much. He didn't really have any kind of, from my opinion, any knowledge on what was going on. And he brought up in the incident, what happened to Rayshard Brooks in America. So we got into a debate about this, and, you know, I shared my opinions, and, you know, he shared it, and we came round to the UK and the racism in the UK, and he basically doesn't think that there is racism in the UK. I've shared some cases with him that I read about on the internet and things like that, and his opinion and his way of seeing and thinking was, this is what I've seen on the news, this is what the news has told me, therefore I believe this. And I said, so then I said, if you go out and do the research, you will see the amount of racism that goes on in the UK. And I shared some stories. My son's dad is Black Caribbean, and obviously I'm Hindu, and we experienced, when we were together, a lot of racism. And also, he used to get stop and search by the police all the time. Now, he wasn't known to the police. He had no associates. Like, you know, he was a really good guy. You know, every time they searched him, never found anything on him. And I'm not kidding. It happened nearly every time he left the house and he was out and about, or he was just outside his house. And I shared that with him, and he accused me of lying, basically, and said that that doesn't happen in the UK. You know, stop and search rates aren't really high, and this, and you know, and I guess what I'm really baffled by is that why don't we hear enough about what's going on in the UK as well as America? Because clearly there are some people in the UK who aren't educated on racism. And just going back to what I think Abby was saying, and possibly Kelly as well, maybe, you know, if there are people out there who follow the news, follow the media, and there just isn't enough about the racism that goes on in the UK. And he was so adamant, he was defending the police. And I said, you know, I'm not saying that all police are bad. You know, my issue is with the ones who abuse their power, and, you know, it's not right. And, you know, and it's not right to just stop and search people. People have a right to freedom to walk down the street without fear of being stopped and searched, or, you know, arrested or anything like that. And the lack of education that he had, and I mean, he was quite bad because he completely refused to go out and do the research himself. And his reason was that, well, racism's in the past. This country is really equal, so why do we need to talk about this now? Why are we raising awareness about this now? And it's like he was almost refusing to believe that it goes on in the UK. And I don't think we hear enough about what happens in the UK either. His point of view is, well, it happens in America, so just leave it over there. Why are we fighting over here? So, you know, I guess what I'm asking really is just, you know, what are your views on, how can we raise more awareness about racism in the UK as well, to get people over here to understand the extent of what's going on here? Thank you.
Thank you, Chetna. That was brilliant. Dave A, then Clive, then Sean. So Dave A.
Oops, hi again. There I am. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about what Abby was saying about how what do white people have to lose by not accepting that racism exists, as Chetna described, or by being racist and being defensive about people trying to get equality. And it brings to mind, there was a black writer in the USA last century, a guy called W.E.B. Du Bois, and he spoke about the situation in the South. I assume everybody's heard about Jim Crow and the kind of discrimination in the southern USA. And what was happening? Why was it that in the south of the USA, white workers were paid less than they were in the north of the USA? And he put this down to the extreme divisions caused by Jim Crow. And one of the things he postulated the idea of is there's a thing called the psychological wage. So that if you are part of, in this case, white society in the South, you are given a certain, not elite status, but your status is obviously higher than that of the black people around you. And this was used effectively by the ruling class to keep control of society. So in effect, you have something called, and I don't know if it's a real thing, but something called the idea of a psychological wage. Was it Cecil Rhodes said, being born English means you've won the lottery of life? You know, that kind of thing, this idea that somehow it doesn't matter if you're rubbing two pennies together to get by, as long as you're white and therefore you have that superiority. And that's perhaps what's goes on in a lot of racist heads, you know. I might be at the bottom of the pile, but there's somebody beneath me. And that's a very, I don't know, a very seductive idea that keeps people within this racist mode of thinking and stops them actually breaking out of it. That's just a thought. Anyway, cheers.
Thanks, Dave. Right, I've got 2 more people to speak, Clive and then Sean. Before I bring them in, can I just say, if you haven't already spoken, please raise your hand. You know, we welcome your contributions. You can direct questions to Wayman and he will come back on those shortly after the speakers are finished. So please don't think it's too late. Clive.
Evening all. Yes, it's Wayman said earlier that clearly racism is a construct, it's a human construct. There's more genetic difference between the blacks in Africa, throughout Africa, than there is between any black African and a white European. It's not the case that racism has always existed. When the Romans conquered Spain, the Moors were just another tribe to them. In fact, there was a black Roman emperor. What has happened is that racism has developed with capitalism. This is the key element to the debate that we're having. And it's not about white versus black necessarily, although that seems to be uppermost in everybody's mind, and quite rightly, because of the incidents that have happened recently. But, you know, if you look at institutionalized racism, you know, obviously apartheid was an extreme example. The Jim Crow laws, as Dave has referred to, was an extreme example. But then again, the Nazis institutionalized racism against Jews. I mean, Jews came from all types of colors and countries, and therefore could not be defined by their biological state. So similarly, you know, if you look in Britain recently, you know, there was a huge tirade against Bosnians when they came here, and Poles. You know, you get a lot of racism against white East European Poles. I mean, you couldn't tell in Lidl whether somebody's Polish or British. But, sorry, who's that? Okay, so it's not necessary.
It's in the.
What's going on? It's not necessarily a white versus black issue. What racism is about dividing the working class. And when Dave referred to the Du Bois interpretation of the Jim Crow Acts and why were black Africans, Americans in the South earning less than those in the North, I mean, you could equally say that about Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland when there was a huge division. The worst paid people in Britain were all workers in Northern Ireland. But Protestants, as was famously said, liked to be tuppence halfpenny over tuppence. So the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, raised by the Catholics against, you know, white Catholics against white Protestants, was a similar movement and at the same time as the civil rights movement in America, looking for fair and equal opportunities in housing and in employment and the rest of it. But that was whites versus whites. So this division that the capitalists keep putting on us is not to do with black versus white. And we must get out of this trap. Of course, we must expose what's happened with the slave trade. Of course, we must tear down the statues that represent Rhodes and all the rest of them that the British Empire and the butcher's apron was built on. Of course, we must do that, but we must equally recognize that this was all part of the process of capitalism, and it's not just against black people. In fact, there are more statues of Mahatma Gandhi in the world than anybody else, apparently. Mahatma Gandhi was a racist. Let's be quite unclear about this. He was absolutely against for the caste system in India, of which blacks were at the lowest of the untouchable castes. Not only that, he served in the British Army and shot and killed people of other colors. So, you know, this is not a black versus white. That was racism, and India today is an example of institutionalized racism, as I should say is is Israel and Palestine, clearly. And these are similar looking and biologically similar people. But there's no doubt, you know, you can be a Palestinian and live in the state of Israel, but you cannot have the vote. So what am I saying? I'm saying clearly, wherever there is capitalism, there is racism. It is capitalism that we have to overcome while exposing it for doing what it's doing in trying to divide us via racism. And it'll keep doing it, and it'll keep doing it as long as these stupid police officers like Chauvin in America thinks that he's tuppence halfpenny over a black American who's tuppence to him.
That was excellent, Clive. Thank you very much. I've got Sean and then Dave Kay. And as I say, before I bring Sean in, if you want to contribute, raise your hand. Okay, please don't feel nervous to do so. Sean.
Hi. Yeah, right. First of all, I want to say I think it's quite important what Andy from Leicester said about the fact that, you know, many white people are anti-racist and not just would describe themselves as non-racist to such an extent. I think when I think of somebody describing themselves as non-racist, it's like, it just makes me think of a person that says, I'm not racist, but, and you know, they're going to launch into some kind of racism, you know. It's always, for a long, long time, since the civil rights movement, I can remember, it's been a polarizing thing inside the class, you know. You tend to be on one side or the other. And there are many, many actively fighting anti-racists. I think it was Tony mentioned council housing and the fact that there's like separation. Councils have tended to separate and isolate black communities in certain areas. Actually, I read something about that, which is slightly interesting, which is that that's much more prevalent in the Northwest, places like Burnley, etc. Maybe not including Liverpool, but around Manchester area there, than it is in the Midlands in Coventry, for example, right? And I think it might be, it's been sometimes used to say that there is, you know, slightly more racism in the Northwest because of that sort of material happening, you know, than there is here. I think there's lots of other factors as well, so I wouldn't overemphasize that. But, you know, in Burnley, when they flew that plane, when that one guy, or whoever it was, flew that plane saying White Lives Matter over the stadium or a huge football match, I think it's interesting what happened afterwards. So actually Burnley Football Club immediately actually wanted to totally divorce themselves from it, you know, and say how disgusting it was to fly something called White Lives Matter, you know, over Burnley Football Club, because the Black Lives Matter movement has had that massive impact, you know, that although racism may be institutionalized in society, when people are fighting back against it, they can certainly see it for what it is. And it's not acceptable for them to just, you know, live with something like that happening. Actually, even something like Burnley Football Club and most of the press, it became something that was a terrible event, you know, that somebody could think that they could do that. And in fact, Mamouna sort of was arguing, when can we say that we will get rid of this? When will we get rid of this racism, you know? And I can understand her feeling that and wanting to know the answer to that. But I have to say that I think because racism is such a prevalent part of institutionalized capitalism, I don't think we will see the total end of it. It'll always be there, but sometimes it's more prevalent than at other times. And what's inspiring, I think, is when people are fighting against it. I mean, you can see it in the rest of the working class as well. If you like, we've got a massively unequal society, or a tiny proportion of people own most of the wealth, you know, and most of us suffer as a result of that, you know, from inequality. And actually, as several of the other speakers said, feeling like tuppence halfpenny is better than tuppence is one of the things that what the ruling classes uses to try and keep that intact, you know. When people are fighting back, like nobody thought much about the miners until they went on strike and fought back. And then they had massive support from the rest of the working class of their various strikes, because people found it inspiring that somebody was leading a fight back against this inequality, you know. And I think it's the same with Black Lives Matter now. Masses of people outside of what we call BAM are still inspired by it, you know, and that's something that's great that we can look to. We can't look, I don't think, to completely end it under the existing system until we get rid of it, but we can drive it back. And if this movement is not just a flash in the pan, if we can build something more permanent out of it to unite BAM people and white working class people, then we can finally have a power that could smash the system and get rid of it like Mamuna would like. That's all I wanted to say, Tom.
Thank you. Okay, I've got Kelly, then Dave, Kay, then Tony. Okay, so Kelly, come in, please. Thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to say, about 3 weeks ago, I actually attended a Black Lives Matter protest in Nottingham, and I was quite empowered and impressed to see a whole array of people there, so white, black, Muslim, a whole mixture of people. So it just shows that, you know, if we all can continue to stand united against it, then hopefully we can, you know, eventually, ideally would like to eradicate it. But yeah, in response to the last gentleman saying that, you know, not all white people are racist and not all black people have got a chip on the shoulder and can't let go of certain things, you know, it is a case that, you know, there are a minority of people that are for it, and or majority of people, I would say, after being there at the march 3 weeks ago. But yeah, I was just impressed and empowered to see a whole mixture of people there really supporting and standing up for just equality in general, really.
Thank you, Kelly. Then Dave, and then Tony.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I just want to go back to I started to disagree, I think, with Andy from Leicester about this issue around what white people and fear, and why we fear the issues around racism, because I think fear about race is something we're taught. We're not born with it. There's no baby in a pram that fears a black, you know, white baby that fears a black baby. However, it is taught from a very early age, and it's ingrained in the UK, because I've been brought up in the UK, in my own education, in the books I read, in the TV I watched, even before I understood what was going on in the TV programmes, in the language that I speak myself, and the history of the country that I was brought up in. And so I don't think we can underestimate the influence of racism on white people, even liberal or left-wing white people. And I think it's important we recognise that. But I think we have to say very clearly it's a false fear. It's a fear that people like Boris Johnson breed in us because, and it's a simple answer, they want to play the game they've been playing since the Industrial Revolution and before, of divide and rule. And the reason I say that is because I think it's really important now. And by the way, Burnley is in East Lancashire. East Lancashire, the history of racism is very acute because of the history of the economy in East Lancashire and the cotton trade. And there's no coincidence why racism still remains a serious problem in that particular part of England. But I think what I want to come back to is the reason that these people use racism so, you know, in so many different ways, particularly through the institutions we often work with, and I work in a local authority, is because they know that it's the best weapon they've got when they want to see us put down as white people as well. And I think it's really important that the Black Lives Matter movement is going to be potentially a catalyst for something that could be really inspirational for all of us in all areas of our lives, because it's about not just about the energy about black people leading a fight against racism in the here and now. It's giving white people as well the idea that we don't have to sit down and take this shit. And we're going to get some serious shit, because when the furlough ends and when the businesses carry on making redundancies, and when in the public sector they come for the money and to take it off us to pay for their crisis, we're going to have two options, aren't we? We're going to have two options, and that's to take their fear and to kick down. And that's what they want us to do. But as white people, we can be inspired by black people themselves fighting back into the idea that actually our lived in experience, if we're honest with ourselves, where we work, live with, and mix with black people of whatever their particular ethnic origin, it's overwhelmingly a positive experience and massively enriches our lives. Therefore, on the back of that, we have to say white workers can be and must be won, not only to the fight against racism, but if you can understand the source and the cause of racism, that means you take the inspiration to fight back in other areas of our lives as well. So I think Black Lives Matter isn't just a fight for black people about racism, it must be that, and black people are the victims over and over and over again, but we have to say, in siding with the people who are being down-pressed, we can take on the down-pressers, and those people want to suck our blood as well. So black and white need to unite.
Excellent contribution. Thank you, Dave. Okay, I'll bring in Lorraine and then Tony, and then if we bring back Wayman, if that's okay, folks. Thanks, Lorraine.
Yeah, hi. My question is around hostile environment. Yeah, so we all agree that the hostile environment is racist. So my question is, what should we be doing about people who are stuck in the immigration system as a result of hostile environment? So I would welcome suggestions from anybody, really, because it is an issue. Thank you.
Tony, thank you, Lorraine, as well. Tony.
Thanks. I think one of the to answer or try and answer a few of the questions. I mean, I think it's easy for them to talk about America, isn't it, or somewhere else, because it's always, you know, they can always say, oh, it's different there. It's not the same here. We're different. We're not the same as that. We're not racist. We're not like that. And it's always easy to argue about, oh, America's different or whatever, and it's just not true, is it? And I think we always need to bring it back to home, because I mean, it's home where the problem is for us, because we have to live here and we have to start from where we are and where we live. And although we support race, you know, people fighting racism in America, actually it's here that we can do something. It's here that affects our friends, our family, and us. And that's where we've got to start from and challenge their rubbish, saying, oh, we're different. It doesn't happen here. And we have to say, no, it does happen here. And I think the problem with the argument sometimes is we can get so focused on one issue. Because I think it works better for all of us if we challenge injustice in general. Because I think it means it helps not to be labelled for a start off. And I think what we need to be seen as is, you know, oh, you're the trade unionist here, aren't you? Or you're the socialist here. Not, oh, you're the one that, you know, always complains about such and such. Because I think we could end up people being bothered about their one thing, couldn't they? We could say, oh, I'm worried about, you know, older people not being, you know, equally having equality, or I could be because I'm young and saying, oh, young people today are treated differently, or you could be a woman. I mean, we could have had these discussions that have been on tonight quite easily and not mention race once, but just mention oppression of women and the fact that they never mention how many women are being beaten up by their partners and all of that. You know, they don't mention poverty. We could have the discussion about poverty, couldn't we? And say, you know, I know people that say there's no poverty in Britain. There is no people going without food. There aren't people without shoes, or have a choice about, you know, paying the bills or whatever. You know, so it could be all of those things. We could have picked religion. And the problem is we could argue about religion all the time, couldn't we? And say, why are you talking about this religion, not that religion? Or why are you about, I'm just going to talk about women all the time. And I think that just falls into their trap. It falls into their trap that we're divided again. It's just divided in a different way. Instead of being black or white, we're dividing over and fighting over what we're fighting for. And we're breaking our forces. Instead of fighting for all of us and all inequalities and all oppression, we've got to do it together. And I have to, as a man, be as worried about what's happening to a black person or a woman or a young person, or the facts, you know. And I think if we're at work, what we do is we say, will you sign this petition about Black Lives Matter? Will you join with me? Will you do it over the libraries and say no to the libraries? Will you do it over the cleaners not being paid enough because they haven't got a proper contract? And it then changes the way people look at us. And it changes the way we can fight back, because they don't put you in a box and they don't label you other than that actually you're the one that fights for injustice and the bigger issues and the reason why we're all in the same mess.
Excellent. Thank you, Tony. My apologies, Wayman, before you come back in, Jean has put a hand up and would like to contribute. So Jean, come in. Jean, you're still muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay.
Right. Jean, you're still muted. There you go. Yeah, you're back.
Okay.
Yeah,
Hi, yeah. I just wanted to respond to Lorraine. Lorraine asked about people who are stuck in the immigration system with regards to the hostile environment. Right. Lorraine, there's a national group called WINOG, Windrush National Organisation Group. And there's a number of people in that group who have some expertise in this, the immigration problem with regards to the Windrush generation. They're working with the Home Office on individual problems as well as the collective. So if you need to be referred to someone, you can do it through me. There's solicitors and barristers and all sorts of people in that group who are dealing with that problem. So please come to me and I'll refer you. Yes?
Okay. Yeah, I will definitely ask for your contacts, but I was also looking at the bigger, you know, yes, I know we have one issue with the windrush, which has not been sorted, but I'm also looking at undocumented migrants, of which I'm one of them, as well as refused asylum seekers, as well as, you know, all sorts of irregularities. Yeah, so I'm just looking at the broad.
There's some immigration solicitors on that group who will help with,
Thank you.
So do get in touch.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. That's been a brilliant discussion, and thank you for everyone's contributions. So Wayman is going to come in and sum up and try to answer some questions and address your contributions. Thank you, Wayman.
I think this has been a brilliant talk, actually. It's been really useful to talk to people who are grappling with the problem about getting rid of institutional racism and racism in general. And what I'd like to say is that when people experience racism, they experience it as an individual or as a group. So, you know, my own personal experience is it's horrific. It's true. You know, to be perfectly honest, when I was a child, people actually tried to kill me as a child going to school. And, you know, there was open discrimination in school and out of school. And it's never really, you know, but it's gone up and down depending upon the level of fight back that's taking place in society. And I think what we have to do is try and draw these things together. And what I think Marx talked about people having contradictory consciousness. What he meant was that sometimes people just accept everything, and then sometimes they just turn around and say, well, we're not going to put up with that. And I think you see that from time to time. It's true that Boris Johnson has a majority, but he had to give in to Rashford when he said that kids could get school meals, because the ruling class can't always get it right. They can't rule because they also rule by a level of consensus, because they're a minority class in society. And even if they had the police, they need a relative level of consensus to do that. And that's why racism plays an important part of explaining the others that don't belong. Somebody else, like the migrants don't belong. The West Indians who came in the Windrush, they don't belong because economically the situation has changed. So we don't need that labor. So there's always a constant attempt to reproduce a level of racism. When I was growing up, if you said to somebody was Asian, the stereotype was they're working very hard in a corner shop or something like that, which is a racist stereotype itself. Today, if you talk about the same set of people, people say they're terrorists or something like that. So you see a reproduction of a new form of racism, which is based on divide and rule. That's the way that it works. But your experience of this is experience as an individual. And therefore, within the struggle, you have this kind of contradictory thing taking place. So firstly, you have to talk about your own victories. When I was growing up, there's a National Front. We smashed the National Front by black and white unity. We smashed it. It doesn't mean everybody came along. It was actually in the struggle, the collective struggle, a collection of struggle, that people started to feel confident that they could do that. there were discussions. And actually, for somebody who's from Eton, like Boris Johnson, he has nothing in common with somebody who's from a comprehensive school in real terms. But he tended to do that in that use populist racism, capture some of the UKIP vote in order to win the election. That's the truth of it. And I think there's a massive argument about how we win and change now. They tried to use the Britain First and the fascists in London to deter Black Lives Matter demonstrations. To a certain extent, they were successful. Let's be honest about that. They were able to divert, say, don't come out and demonstrate, because there could be a confrontation with the far right. And Boris Johnson said, I was worried about Bother Boys. In other words, we have to have a strategy about how we defeat it. And there's this strategy on 3 different levels. If you're at work, you need a union. You need to collectively, politically argue inside the workplace what you need to do. So if we want to win the question of Black Lives Matter, we need to connect what happened around COVID in terms of disproportionate deaths and lack of PPE with the question of racism and the fact that really, when they don't care about our lives, they want to destroy. They use racism. Racism sharpens that thing. It makes it harder. It makes it more differential. But who benefits from racism? Who are the beneficiaries? Is it the individual in front of you? By and large, somebody mentioned Du Bois. Frederick Douglass said they divide each to conquer both. They use racism to play against each other. But it matters that in each struggle, there, for the first time, there's black generals leading a mass movement. It could detonate something else. Because basically, you tell the people to F off, the people at the top of your society, tell them, I'm not going to be able to put up with this. It gives other people confidence. And also, to be honest, something else has happened. When I was growing up, somebody made a racist statement, they weren't sacked. Like the guy in Burnley's been sacked. In other words, the pressure of anti-racists shifts the atmosphere. When I grew up, Nelson Mandela was still in prison. He's free. It's because he's part of the struggle. My son experiences racism differently, but nevertheless, my son had his trousers pulled down in the street and searched when he was 16, in the same way as I did. So some things have changed and some things have continued. And the things that have changed are being pushed back are a consequence of the struggles that we've been involved in. When the EDL was beaten in the Northwest and Tommy Robinson was labelled a Nazi, that was a step forward for the anti-racist majority. There's an anti-racist majority. There's contradictory ideas with an anti-racist majority. The question is who's going to lead them? And what difference are we going to make now? I think people said what makes people afraid is when they're weak. Oscar Wilde said you're either watching the shit in the gutter or you're aiming for the stars. If people are fighting and competing against each other, which is the nature of capitalism, Marx argued that capitalism divided into capitals, like companies fighting each other, like Apple and IBM, and also that because of that, nations fighting each other, competing for resources, and that's why they used imperialism, but also individuals. When you go to a job interview, you don't hope that the other person gets the job and you don't. You hope that you get the job and they don't get it. In other words, it's built into society. When you do an exam, you don't say, I hope everybody gets a AAA. You say, I hope I get a AAA. And that way of operating our society is built in and underpins the level of racism. Racism goes up and down depending on the amount of competition. In periods of where people are denied resources, it's a useful tool and it is used in that way. What we have to do is show that how we can weaken them. Look at Trump. Trump tried to use racism as his key motor, and actually he's finding things are much more difficult because people have a collective experience of the fight against COVID and the fact that our government doesn't care. So what I would say is that's important. Join a union, be politically active, organise with other people, organise a united front. When people say, what can we do? There's a united front called Stand Up to Racism. There's campaigning over these different rights. I would say join that, participate in that. Participate in, there are people there from the Labour Party, there are people there from Greens, there are people there from XR. Participate in a large number of people being able to campaign, because we are the majority when it comes into racism. But there is something I particularly want to argue. I want to argue the question that was asked, when will this change? And how will we change it? We can push racism back. We can weaken it, but it keeps reasserting itself. And there's a very good chance that we are going to face the worst depression since the 1930s. And it will set worker against worker. And one of the things it will set against is entitlement, who's entitled to something and who's not entitled to it. And therefore, what I would say is that if we want to change our world, then those are big questions. Lenin talked about some people being the tribune of the oppressed. What that meant was the tribunes were elected in Rome, and they were people that stood for the poorest people in society. And I think there's a special role for socialists. To be perfectly honest, when I joined the SWP 30 years ago, lots of people denied racism. They said it didn't happen. I don't find that in the SWP. I found racism in the Labour Party, to be perfectly honest. And I also found racism when I was active in different places, fighting racism. I had to work with people that said racist things. But I think there's a special place for a particular type of organisation that's multiracial, that is based on fighting and destroying the basis of racism, and does that in an everyday basis. And that's what's special about the Socialist Workers' Party. It tried to connect all those things and gives a direction. But also, as long as we've got capitalism, we'll never get rid of racism. As long as we've got capitalism, it will never stop polluting the environment. As long as we've got capitalism, it'll put profit ahead of women's health. As long as we've got capitalism, it matters who you sleep with, when you sleep with them, what and how you do it, because it matters about your chopped and controlled, or what God you worship. It's inbuilt into the system, competition, war, and imperialism. And removing that, at the end of the day, is the only way to do it. Actually, in the heights of struggle, in 1917, I know it seems like a long way, I don't say Russia's socialist or anything like that, but when in the midst of that height of that revolution, it was Jewish people who were considered the blacks of Russia who ended up leading that with women. And I think that when we talk about changing our world, I think we have to understand the underpinning of it has to be removed. And for that to happen, we actually need different types of organisation. We need organisations that's based on eradicating racism, not living with it, not tolerating it, not just ameliorating it, not just breaking up the fascists, but breaking up the system that reproduces it and continues to reproduce it. And you need a special group of people to do that reject that level of inequality. And to do that, you need socialists. You actually need organised socialists that join that things together. And I think this is the challenge of the 21st century. And if you feel that way, that, you know, with what's happening to the Black Lives Matter movement, we have to make sure it's not crushed, because the government's attempting to crush it. They're trying to crush it in America. And for that, we have to join up unity between the different types of people that are affected. And we have to think our way through it and act our way through it. And if you feel that way, then join the Socialist Workers' Party. I joined because I was sick and tired of racism and the police. It was the best decision I made, because it didn't stop me from feeling sick of it. It didn't stop me from feeling tired of it. But what it made the difference was it organised the fight against it. And in the fight against it, that's where your confidence comes from. So please join us. We're just involved in the beginning of this discussion. I'd like to continue that discussion with other people about the other things. Join us, continue the discussion. If you build a Socialist Workers' Party, I promise you, and we change our world, we can get rid of racism. That's not yellow brick road stuff. The red brick road is the one we're talking about. But the question is, if you build that, we have a chance of changing our world. So let's do that. Join Socialist Workers' Party. Thank you, Coventry, for having me speak and for the contribution on this. And I'll stop there. Solidarity and unity is our way forward.